Hi friends! A short message before we start the episode. Every time we meet a new scientist, we love to chat with him or her over a good coffee or tea. So if you like the show and want to support our work, here are 2 ways to do it. The first one is to go on our page Buy Me a Coffee by following the link in the show notes and to offer us a coffee. Simple, effective, and we won't forget to thank you. The second way is just as simple. Just share your opinion about the episode on Twitter by tagging us at Lonely Pipette. We won't miss to answer you. Thanks again for the sharing and à bientôt!
You know, there's a reason why we focus on retractions. They're public, or at least they should be. They're discrete. They're literally findable. But it's like anything else. You measure what you can measure. You see what you can see. And I think that, and Adam and I always try and make sure to pass along this message, you know, again, it's upstream. It's about the incentive structure that would compel someone or pressure someone or even force someone to do something that would lead to retraction, whether it's being sloppy, making an error, or a fraud. And I think we really need to look at all of that.
Are you working in research, trying to do the best science you can?
Are you a team leader, a research assistant, postdoc, PhD student, or any other type of scientist?
Are you looking for a place where you can sit, relax, and listen to inspiring people?
Well, we have good news for you. You've just found what you're looking for.
Hi everybody, my name is Renaud Pourpre.
And I am Jonathan Weitzman.
Welcome to the Lonely Pipette,
helping scientists
do better science.
My name is Ivan Oransky. I'm a journalist, professor, and nonprofit executive director. And I feel privileged to share my tips with the Lonely Pipette today.
Ivan Oransky received a bachelor's degree in biology at Harvard University, where he was executive editor of the Harvard Crimson. He then studied medicine at Yale University and the New York University School of Medicine, where he was also the editor-in-chief of Pulse, the medical student section of the Journal of American Medical Association. Ivan has worked as an editor at Medscape, at Reuters Health, at Scientific American, and The Scientist. From 2017 until 2021, he served as the president of the Association of Healthcare Journalists. Ivan co-founded Retraction Watch, which is a blog reporting scientific retractions, and he's on the board of directors of the PubPeer Foundation. Today, he is a distinguished writer in residence at New York University's Carter Journalism Institute and editor-in-chief of the Transmitter magazine. He is the recipient of the 2015 John McGovern Medal for Excellence in Biomedical Communication from the American Medical Writers Association. And in 2017, he was awarded an honorary doctorate in civil law from the University of the South. Ivan is a tireless advocate for monitoring scientific misconduct. Ivan, thanks for coming to share your tips with the Lonely Pipette.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jonathan.
Thank you, Ivan, for being with us. You've listened to a few episodes of the Lonely Pipette. You might know what is my first question, but still I'm going to ask it because it's a kind of gimmick we have here. We wanted to know a little bit the origin story. So what was the spark that ignited your passion for a career in science and then medicine?
You know, the way that I think about it, I came from a long line of doctors, of physicians. So my grandfather was a general practitioner. My father was a pediatrician. So I grew up in a house where there were a couple things that were true. One was that the dinner table conversation was often about, I wouldn't say pure science in the sort of a basic sense, but absolutely scientific in the sort of clinical sense. We talked about, cases my father had seen. I learned a lot more about strep throat and sort of other issues that pediatricians might be treating and taking care of than probably most kids. I wrote a play. It was actually a short story that was presented as a play by I believe it was my 6th grade class. So when I was 11 years old, I wrote a play about the immune system. And it's so terrible that...
What was it called? What was it called?
I've posted it online so that no one can find it. And I posted it online so that everyone can find it. Nobody can discover it and sort of demonstrate the utter incompetent that I am. I don't remember the title. That's a great question, Renaud. But it basically, to give you a sense of it, it was all the characters of the immune system were in it. Not all of them, but a good number of them. So there was a general Teasel, right, for T cell, and a general Beazle, right. There was a line toward the end when they've conquered the Streptococcus bacterium, and they say to they're slapping each other, hitting each other on the back, and saying "good job," and saying, "Hey, let's go party in the spleen where there's some extra protein." So this was the 11-year-old Ivan Oransky who, again, grew up thinking about medicine as the thing that you did because that's what everyone did in my family, but also grew up very interested in journalism and very active in journalism in my high school, and at my high school newspaper. I was editor-in-chief of that as well. And that's kind of where I guess it started.
Is there anything else that was on the possibilities, or was it was going to be medicine or journalism, or was there some other hidden choice?
I'm not even sure it was going to be medicine or journalism until sometime in college is when I really started thinking about it. And even in medical school, I thought, okay, well, I enjoy writing. It seems to be something that, people are actually asking me to write various things. When I was, I think it was during my first year of medical school, I ended up I was invited to write the introduction, I think it was a foreword technically, to a sort of new medical dictionary, which, I actually, that was the first time I'd ever been paid to write anything. I got $500, which was nice when you're a medical student and needed to buy beer or dinner or a stethoscope in that order. And so I think I always was just fascinated by writing. I guess the other, maybe it's part of the origin story, when I was growing up, so I grew up outside of New York, outside of New York City. And, not to say exactly how old I am, but I'm old enough that I learned how to read a newspaper in print. That was a thing. We had what we just thought of as the local paper, the New York Times, delivered to our house, which, lots of people did. And I would read the New York Times, and one of the things that I saw was there was somebody named Lawrence Altman, MD, who was not infrequently on the front page of the New York Times. And I noticed a few things. One is that he was writing about medicine, which the MD makes sense, which meant he had a medical degree, so he was acceptable as a reporter in my family, to my parents and others. But he was also the only person, until I think somewhat recently, and maybe it's still true, who was allowed at the New York Times to use the honorific, in other words, the MD after his name. They didn't let anybody else do that. Now, they were very proud of having Lawrence Altman, Larry Altman, as he's known, as this correspondent. He was the medical correspondent for the New York Times for 40 years, until 2009. And so that was really inspiring to me. I'm sorry, that shouldn't have happened, but I'll start again. That was really inspiring to me. The idea that, there was someone who, again, obviously was a physician, had trained, and that's what I was supposed to do, and was also a leading world-class journalist at the world's arguably, greatest newspaper. And so that was also part of my inspiration. At some point during my medical internship, so this is the year after medical school, I sort of realized that I could probably do one thing well, and it was going to have to either be psychiatry, which is what I was training in, or journalism. And I ended up choosing journalism and figured if it didn't work out, I could go back at some point and finish my residency. But that was, 25 years ago, so I think it's probably a little too late. Plus, I don't want to.
So what was the reason why you transitioned from a career from medicine to journalism? What made do you choose to do
Well,
that?
I was really having a lot of fun writing. I wasn't really editing at the time. You can't, writing is time shiftable. So I was a medical intern, and I know this is not sort of unusual around the world, and rules different. There are different rules in different places, but I think what's universal is that you're working really, really long hours. And so at the time that I was a medical intern, I was working 100, 110 hours a week, and there were no rules in the state in the U.S. where I was. There were rules actually in New York State by then. Now they're national, and that's relevant because I was writing a monthly column for a medical newspaper that went to all the members of the American Medical Association, so hundreds of thousands of doctors. I was writing a monthly column about being an intern, about being a medical intern, and a lot of it was how kind of depressed I was, scared I was, tired I was. I had a column where I think it was every sentence started with "I am tired." I'm tired of being tired. I'm tired of not having a life. I'm tired of nearly killing people because I don't know what I'm doing. I'm tired of all sorts of things. Well, there was a dean at the medical school where I was in training then. So I trained, my internship was up at Yale in New Haven, in Connecticut. And this dean, I must have read some of my columns, which said where I was. There was the bottom of the column said I was a, resident at Yale. And he wrote a letter, an actual physical letter, because that's what they did back then. And he sent it to me, but he also copied everyone. Now you would just send this to 100 people by email. But he actually sent it to everyone who had anything to do with my training. So, the director of the psychiatry residency program, I think he figured out who my current attending was. That was my supervisor on the wards when I was doing whatever rotation I was doing. I mean, a dozen people probably. I still have the letter. I keep meaning to frame it and put it on my wall. But what ended up happening was, and this was around the time when people were starting to get back to the work hours issue. People were starting to actually unionize, but they were starting to, agitate and sort of, have a movement for better working conditions and particularly hours for residents. So the New York folks sort of caught wind of this, and they somehow had, or maybe it was the other way around. Now I have to remember exactly the details. But in any case, the local sort of alternative news weekly, the sort of slightly feistier, newspaper, did a profile of me. They interviewed me and they did a profile of me. And I don't know, some combination of that and going home every night to write, to report out stories, to, I had two different columns at that time. That was just one of them. Made me think, well, maybe I should try this. And that was that.
Well, that's nice. I have a question related to that. It's when you started to write, how has your background in medicine influenced your approach to reporting scientific topics? Is there anything was really?
Yeah, I think what happened, to back up a little bit, I even when I was in college, I was pre-med and I was a biology major. I worked in a lab. I did all the sort of science things you do as an undergraduate. I wrote a thesis, which had no data in it. Nowadays in my current, life, maybe I would have made up the data because that's what everybody else seems to be doing that I write about. But I think I had one Western blot that was like the entire thesis. But my thesis reader said, "This is the best literature review I've ever seen in an undergraduate thesis. Where are your data?" That should have probably.
It's the worst Western blot, but
it was a completely unusual. It was a completely it was just a totally typical Western blot. It had nothing. It didn't really prove anything. I think it proves that I had spliced a plasmid. This is sort of 1993. Nowadays, what I was trying to do is create a mouse, a mouse model of lupus. And so part of the complement cascade, it was a complement lab. I was interested in that. You can see the immune system, right? So I write a play about the immune system when I was 11 years old. When I'm, 20, 21 years old, I'm working in a complement lab. You could see how this all works together, sort of. If anyone ever cares to look at the narrative, that there's an arc there. But then it ended with the world's least impressive thesis, undergraduate thesis ever.
But the best written.
But the best written, I had like 125 references. I mean, if you needed to know anything about how the complement system might be implicated in lupus, it's apparently 30 years. Well, if you want 30-year-old data on that, you're welcome to. Anyway, but during that time, I covered the medical school at my university as a reporter. So I always was sort of interested in that, and combined my interest and my very small expertise, but obviously growing expertise as I continued in school with what I was writing about. I think that once I went to journalism full time, a couple things happened. I think that what was interesting about when I did that, at least historically, so this is, again, 25 years ago now, there was still I would say a sort of healthy, respectful skepticism of expertise in journalism. Now, I don't mean that in the current way where there's skepticism about journalism among, lots of people in the world, or skepticism about science or expertise at all, which is causing lots of issues. I don't mean that. There was this idea, which, to be honest, isn't sort of totally out there, that if you had expertise, particularly if you had a doctorate of some kind, a PhD, an MD, you were definitely knowledgeable. That was not a question. You were an expert in subject matter, but you probably would never figure out how to communicate with people who weren't experts. So you want to write as a PhD, you have a PhD in neuroscience, you want to write for a scientific audience about related issues, great, go for it. You're a medical doctor, you want to write for other doctors or, other healthcare professionals about medicine, clinical issues, go for it. But don't come to us at the, whatever newspaper or news outlet. So on the one hand, that was an issue. On the other hand, it opened a lot of doors in certain kinds of publications, and also in terms of certain interviews, and sort of getting people to talk to me, which was good and bad. So one of the things that I found, and I always talk to my students at NYU about this, is you don't want to give the impression that you have too much expertise, or even that your readers have any expertise at all, because you'll end up with, as I often did, a notebook full of jargon. And so I would, and I would put at the bottom of my emails, because I was very proud of it, and my parents are very proud of it, MD at the end of all my emails. And I still do that for different reasons now, but because there would be researchers, doctors, clinicians, who would respond to my email. I remember actually competing in a fun way with some, a friend of mine who I knew was reporting on the same thing, but for a major news outlet. And the source actually called me back first, because he was like, oh, this guy, he's got an MD, so he'll understand what I'm talking about. I did, but he talked to me in, scientific ease. So it's one of those things. I will say, though, and this gets back to, Larry Altman and being, I think, not necessarily the first, but kind of really the most prominent for a long time, physician journalist of certainly of his generation. That's changed a lot. I mean, if you look at a lot of major publications now, and you dig into their bios, even if they're not using their degrees, a lot of them covering specialty subjects have advanced degrees, which I think is a really good development. So you have people, covering physics or math who actually have a PhD in physics. You have, people covering the basic, life sciences, for example, who have PhDs in related fields. Actual MDs, other than television, it's still somewhat rare, but it's definitely growing.
That wasn't the case at the time, right? So did someone help you transition into journalism? Did you have some mentors or?
I mean, I definitely had mentors. One of my mentors actually, who I still consider him a mentor. He's definitely retired now, and I'd like to think I'm firmly established and all that. But it's still always good to have mentors you can talk to about whatever you're working with and working on. One of them was George Lundberg. So he was the editor-in-chief of JAMA. I'm forgetting the exact dates, but from like the early 1980s until 1999, when he was actually fired for a sort of saucy, interesting story involving, he published a study in the middle of the Monica Lewinsky, sort of Bill Clinton impeachment hearings. It was probably the last straw for the AMA, which owns JAMA. Anyway, but George and I met, and I think, if I'm giving advice, which I hope I'm not, I'm just sort of telling stories and people can take what they want. But the one bit of advice that I do give to my students or to really anyone starting out is like, take advantage of the opportunities where to sort of put yourself in front of people you might, want to work with or learn from or have any relationship with. And that's what I did with George. So he was a visiting lecturer of some kind, professor at the School of Public Health when I was an undergraduate at the same university. And I saw that and I thought, oh, journalism and journals and medicine, and I want to do some of those things. So I went to see him. I went to see one of his lectures and I introduced myself and made an appointment to go to office hours. Went over there, and it happened that it was like within a week of my being admitted to the first medical school that I was admitted to. Not the one I went to, but I knew I was going to medical school at that time, at that point, even if it was that one, which turned out not to be my first choice, but okay. And I said, I just want to introduce myself, and I'm on the student newspaper, and I'm going to, and then he said, well, oh, what are you doing next year? And I said, oh, I just got admitted to medical school. He said, medical school, that's great. You should be a member of the JAMA medical student publication. They had a monthly journal as part of JAMA. The group that edits that. That's perfect, So I said, okay, sign me up. And, he did. Well, he didn't. He told me who to talk to about applying and all those things. And he, again, remained a mentor to me and still is for many years. But I think there were lots of people who helped me. I mean, on every possible way that my career has developed. So that is maybe more on the, I trace that experience at JAMA very directly to my current obsession and work with scientific publishing and peer review and all that and Retraction Watch. But, I would send drafts of freelance pieces to my friends from college who had been in journalism, had gone straight to journalism and were working at, major news outlets and helped me out. They introduced me to people I could write for, and pitch stories to. Other people helped me think about how to be an editor. Someone at JAMA in particular named Charlene Breedlove, but a lot of other people too. Other people taught me my very first job, my first full-time job after I left medicine was actually as an editor. I was the founding editor-in-chief of a new publication that somebody was launching. And, I didn't know how to be a manager. I had never managed anything or anyone. And it was a small team, thankfully. If it was a large team, I would have failed at it. But I then had mentors who taught me how to, help me learn how to do that. So it's an important thing to develop in any way you can. And I've always believed that. I try to help my students do that too.
How do you choose what to write about? What determined that?
To be honest, now I don't so much choose what to write about. I choose
when you started writing. So apart from writing that you were tired, how do you make those sort of decisions?
I think it's a combination of things. It depends who you're writing for, and I think that's an obvious but important thing to say. When I was writing a column, I mean, you have to be open to the idea that something you're experiencing is a story, because that was a first-person column for the most part. And so to take a step back, I learned how to do those sorts of things, and I try to train my brain to look for stories by reading other people. I think that, and this is something that concerns me when I, work with students, and I realize that the educational system has either not encouraged them to read regularly or has actually discouraged them, or whether you want to blame technology, you can blame whatever you want. But the outcome is that often the things that I would sort of casually say, I realized early on, particularly my undergraduates, this is not a shared experience. This is not a shared lexicon. So you really have to start by reading, and maybe we should be honest about mimicry and hopefully not actual plagiarism, but mimicry and saying, okay, that's interesting. How do I do that? And you can pay homage and what have you. But so when it was a column, that the stories came to me all the time, and because again I was living it. After that, though, it was a combination. I remember one particular. You have to put yourself in situations where you'll be exposed to things that you couldn't have predicted yourself, which is another reason why sitting in an office or at your laptop or wherever else is not going to get you, I think, as far as you want to go. I would put myself in situations. So when I was freelancing very early on, right after I left, before I took this first job, I was freelancing in Medscape, which I ended up running editorial there 20 years later. But Medscape would send medical writers to medical conferences to do various things. And they saw me, and they saw in me someone who researchers, doctors would sort of trust to get their words right. Whether they were right or not is another question. But they'll trust that you have the MD and all these things, so they'll confide in you and whatever. And so I would sit with them after they would go. They would be kind of the rapporteur from a session they went to, like a panel or symposium or something, and people presenting results. They'd come into this press room, and I would sit next to them, and they would sort of talk to me about what they saw, and I would write it down. And I thought, you did this, and that. It would shape it into something. Okay, fine. That was an assignment, pretty lucrative actually, because it was a good business model. All that, all good. But while I was there, this guy walks in. He's interested in Medscape. It was relatively new at the time, and he said, and he asked about Medscape, and I tell him a little bit about it. And I said, well, tell me what you do. And it turns out he was a fellow in orthopedic surgery at the time. So in other words, sort of advanced training in orthopedic surgery. But he was doing a lot of research. He was like a research fellow. And he was studying estrogen and ACL, so, the ligament, anterior cruciate ligament, in rats, in female rats in particular. And I said to him, okay, why? Like, what you showed up to the lab late and everybody else had taken all the interesting...
All the good questions are taken.
And he says, well, here's why. He proceeds to tell me, I'll tell this somewhat shorter version, but at the time, again, this is about 1999, there'd been a rash of female, particularly college, but not only college, basketball players who, in rapid succession, blew out their ACLs. In other words, they tore their ACLs. This was pretty catastrophic for the basketball team, and people were understandably concerned about this. And it seemed to be happening at a much higher rate in female athletes and women than in male athletes playing the same sports. Well, people had all kinds of theories, one of which thankfully turned out to be wrong, but one of which was somebody published a study allegedly linking the menstrual cycle, right, and time during the menstrual cycle to ACL tears. And they said, oh, maybe hormonal levels, right, they're weakening the tissue, they're doing, okay, I mean, it's a reasonable theory. It leads to some fairly, strange conclusions, or uncomfortable conclusions, maybe, like, well, we have to bench everyone on certain days of this is where people were starting to get, right? And these are sportscasters, so they're just going with it. And that turned out to be wrong, and we probably could have predicted it was going to be wrong, but okay, people did the experiment. But he was doing that kind of work to try and figure out what's really going on, and obviously he was using a rat, a rat model. It turns out to be a much more interesting story than that, though. And so when I got his name and called him later and looked into it and talked to some of the team doctors and some of the other researchers, that became a front page of the Boston Globe science section story. And so, long way of answering your question, Jonathan, but, you get stories from paying attention, listening, and being open to stuff you didn't know. Because if you're only writing about things you kind of already knew about, your readers aren't going to be very interested. And frankly, that's not very interesting work.
Just to see if you have little thoughts about that, because we lived the COVID crisis recently. False information were spreading rapidly everywhere, and somehow it looks like we were trying to take lessons from that. But today it does not look that much better about the spread of false information. So just a question on your vision of the ecosystem of journalism and research, because we wanted to ask you, do you think that the scientific ecosystem is failing somewhere to communicate efficiently, or where are we failing at?
I think there's a couple things going on, and to me, the communication of findings or conclusions or just trends, it's important. But if we focus too much on that sort of end of things, in other words, that downstream, I think we're missing what's really happening upstream. And I think that one of the really unfortunate things, but somewhat predictable, I think, things that has happened certainly during the pandemic, but it's happened elsewhere as well, it's just accelerated, is what people talk about as the weaponization of, the scientific method, the weaponization of correction or even retraction in the scientific method. And I know that seems like a tiny part of things, but the reason I think it's central is that if you treat every scientific finding, every paper, even every group of papers as definitive, as the answer, and as unassailable and clearly correct because it has been peer reviewed, you end up having a false narrative that is easily, weaponized. In other words, when you have to make a correction or a retraction, you allow people who probably, or at least sometimes, have ulterior motives.
Yeah.
You allow them control of the narrative, and for them to say, well, see, you told us that was true, and now you're telling us it's not true. We don't believe you anymore. Whereas if upstream, and this gets back to the education system, it gets back to just how even the philosophy of science. If you go upstream and think, okay, we're going to tell you that what's important here is the method of science, the experimentation, the null hypothesis, whatever method you're using. And we're also going to tell you that the more evidence that we find, the more confidence we have in a particular, directional finding. But at any given time, all knowledge is provisional. That's a difficult message, right? It's proven to be a difficult message. It's a difficult message because it's already been weaponized, for one. It's also a difficult message because in the middle, particularly of a pandemic or any public health even episode, or it doesn't have to be public health. It could be environmental crisis. It could be,
Sure.
a nuclear, there is the understandable and actually, I think, necessary urge to say, this is what, you should do. But we never sort of say, this is what is most likely, or this is what we have found is more useful than not doing it. Or, by the way, there's some risks here, but overall, the risks are, for any given person are very small, whereas the risks of not doing something, right? I mean, your house is on fire. Jumping out of your window has risks. If you are jumping onto concrete or cement or asphalt, you might hurt yourself. I can assure you, though, that you will die if you stay in a house where smoke is going to kill you, right? And especially if there's someone outside saying, jump, we'll fix your broken leg, right? And yet we've come to so focus on what happens, the broken leg that you'll have that you might have if you jump out of your second or third story of your house or apartment, as opposed to we need to get out of the house. And that I do blame, I have to say, I blame rote memory and kind of knowledge, imposition, as opposed to understanding how to think about, again, knowledge. This is philosophically, this is just epistemology. But the scientific method, which, by the way, I still think is by far the best way to understand the world and understand phenomena. It's about the method. It's not about the result. And everything in the system, from grant applications, if you want to go way upstream, to publishing papers, to newspaper, or journalism, to the communication and to education, is aligned to give you the answer and tell you this is the answer, as opposed to this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and here's how confident we are about it.
So we've obviously missed that nuance in much of communication. Can you tell us? So in 2010, you co-founded Retraction Watch. Can you tell us a little bit about the story behind that and like what was going on?
Yes, what was going on in 2010, and really starting about a year and a half before that, was that Adam Marcus, who is my co-founder of Retraction Watch, and he and I are still very much partners in this endeavor and only spend more and more time on it every year together, now with a small team. Adam had written about what was a pretty important, if not hugely covered case of scientific fraud here in the U.S. It involved someone named Scott Rubin who was working on a painkiller. He was studying a painkiller. He's an anesthesiologist. Adam was the editor, or the managing editor of Anesthesiology News, and so he was well connected with that community. Scott Rubin, it turned out, made up all the data in his clinical trials, out and out faked it. And he was caught eventually by his hospital. Editors started retracting his papers, started looking into it. It was a bit of a watershed moment for anesthesiology, it turns out. And again, Adam was on top of this. He broke the story. And I knew Adam at the time. We didn't know each other that well, but I knew of his work and I knew where he worked and all of that. And I was just fascinated. I thought this was amazing journalism. I thought it was an amazing story. And it got me to thinking that these retraction things that appear in journals pretty rarely, or at least we thought pretty rarely, were interesting. Maybe there's stories behind them. There's bad behavior, which is a kind of a journalistic source of stories, getting back to that. And also we noticed that the retraction notices, when we would trade notes on them, were misleading or wrong or just incomplete. And so I said to Adam one day, I remember actually walking around my living room, we were talking about something, and I said, what if we started a blog? And he said, yeah, whatever. And this is 2010, where, blogs were not new at the time, but they weren't kind of where they ended up. I don't know that he had blogged at all, or maybe he had done a little bit. I had started another blog 6 months earlier. It was even more niche, but that I learned how to do this kind of thing and build an audience and communicate with them and engage them. And we started. We honestly had no idea what we were doing. Not that we didn't know what we were doing day to day. We had no idea how big a project this would become. Well, now we know that, but that's almost 14 years later.
Yeah, so it's interesting because you were wondering what are the stories behind that. How could this happen around journals? So one question we wanted to ask you was, should the academic journals have a responsibility for verifying data? I mean, if they were doing it, you should not have this block. So what's your vision of this?
Academic journals definitely have a responsibility. And I think, to be fair, a number of them have started living that way and acting that way. Some of them, and this goes back some years now, have hired whole teams to look at both papers that have been published and people are raising questions about, which those might get retracted, and also the papers coming in, the manuscripts, the data, things like that. So that's a good sign. It's not most journals. Most journals are not doing that, but a number of journals are doing that. So they recognize that. But I don't think it's only on the journals. Mm-hmm. There's a reason why we focus on retractions. They're public, or at least they should be. They're discrete. They're literally findable. But it's like anything else. You measure what you can measure. You see what you can see. And I think that, and Adam and I always try and make sure to pass along this message, again, it's upstream. It's about the incentive structure that would compel someone or pressure someone or even force someone to do something that would lead to retraction, whether it's being sloppy, making an error, or fraud. And I think we really need to look at all of that. And we've said this for many years, of course, and others definitely have said this. So yes, universities are...
But how's that going to happen, Ivan?
I think that it's actually starting to happen in very small bits. So if you look at something like DORA, right, or this thing called the Leiden Manifesto, in different ways they are basically saying, let's not, focus only on the impact factor as, sort of the coin of the realm, or citations as the coin of the realm. In order to get cited, you need to get published, et cetera. So it all kind of follows along. Because they're seeing, and they saw it before a lot of us, they're seeing just how corrupting that can be, that influence can be. I think the natural inclination is, well, let's replace it with another metric. Well, let's not. Let's actually read papers. Let's actually have people say, not instead of here's 100 papers I published and 12 of them are in these top journals. Here are my 3 top pieces of work. I would like you to, when you are looking at whether I'm a candidate for this position or whether I should be promoted or whatever, here's what you should look at. And I think people have started to do that. It's going to take a lot more effort, but people have started to do that in important ways.
What are your thoughts about the recent debate about plagiarism? Do you think that technology tools are going to change this question? What are your thoughts?
I think technology will definitely find more of it. it's sort of good at that. It's, we often liken, it's not just plagiarism, but any kind of issues in the scientific literature. We liken it to a screening test, say for cancer or some other condition. If you never look for it, or if you only look for it when it's, nearly fatal, it'll look as though it's really rare. Whereas when you have screening tests, whether it's, for plagiarism, it would be authenticate, turn it in. There's image manipulation and duplication and what have you software now that it still has some growing up to do, some maturation to do, but, is sort of getting there, is sort of interesting. So I think they can definitely find it. I think what hasn't happened is a set of clear definitions of what we're really talking about. Mm-hmm. And again, I think those definitions have to acknowledge the pressure that researchers are under, and what might even, again, compel people to, commit plagiarism. The problem is that if you were to actually screen every thesis, every paper for plagiarism, I don't think anyone would like the findings. If you look, for example, at what happened with Claudine Gay at Harvard, and, obviously she stepped down after this. Well, what happened right after that? The wife of one of the people pushing for all of those, for the investigation and for her to step down, all of a sudden everybody was looking at her thesis. She was an academic as well, former academic now. We actually found, long after everybody else had kind of found the core of that, somebody contacted us who, sort of oddly and funny enough, her thesis ended up plagiarizing a piece he had written that had already been plagiarized in another high-profile case, mm-hmm. Right? I mean, it's probably rampant, and I don't say that with any without any great pleasure. It's probably rampant, and again, this concern about weaponizing. If you're only looking for plagiarism or any problem in papers that you disagree with, or at your worst enemy for some other reason, you're not doing it right. It's like any kind of profiling. Lots of people speed, but
so what do you think has been the greatest achievements of Retraction Watch? What have you achieved?
I'm always a little bit sheepish about answering that kind of questions out, and I appreciate it. And I'll give you what I hope are some evidence-based accomplishments, because I hate to sort of say we're amazing, whatever. There are a couple of things I can point to. I think the creation of our database, which was something that we worked on back starting in really about 2015, launched in 2018. That was recently acquired by Crossref, which makes it all open and gives us financial sustainability. And I think that, again, you can ask Crossref whether that was important, but they obviously thought it was important enough to engage in and put money into, put resources into. And we know that is helping to cut down on, citing retracted work, for example. One of the interesting things, I think there are two things. One that I can't point to evidence, strictly speaking, highest level evidence about, but that I'll mention anyway. We now have tons of competition in reporting on misconduct and fraud. We really didn't in 2010. There were people doing it, and every year there'd be some big story, and maybe we'd have it, maybe somebody else would have it. Now, we can't keep up. Everybody has discovered this. I give seminars to other journalists on how to cover these things. I like to think we've catalyzed some of that effort, even though competition for us makes our job a little harder. But I'm actually interested in it for the world. I don't earn a dime at Retraction Watch. So if for some reason it went away, which I really hope it won't, and I work every day to make sure it doesn't, but if it ever went away, I'd actually still have a living and all of that. I'd be very sad. We have a small staff who we do pay. But I like to think that we are a mission-driven, again, nonprofit that is trying to elevate the conversation around this, which I think we've done. The final thing I'll say about impact is a sort of funny one where it turns out, and this is smaller than the other two, but it gives you a sense of what you can actually find when you look for evidence. Someone took our database and then looked at citations of papers that we had covered on the blog, which is actually separate from the database, and that we hadn't covered on the blog. And it turns out that, this is association, it's correlation. It is not necessarily in any way cause effect. The papers we covered on the blog, if they were if they didn't gather a lot of other attention, I should put it that way. In other words, they weren't high-profile papers. They were less likely to be cited, after being retracted than papers we hadn't covered. So, which made me think, oh, great, we should just cover all of them, and then people cut down on citations. Obviously, that's not possible. There were more than 10,000 retractions last year. We're not going to cover all of them. They're not all interesting. But that was, by the way, a scientific paper. It was, peer reviewed and published. I was pretty pleased by that.
So we normally finish with a series of quick fire questions, but the last question I always like to ask is, if you met yourself 20 years ago, what advice would you give yourself?
If I met myself 20 years ago, one bit of advice I would. No, wait, 20 years. Sorry, I'll start again. What year? What year are we in now? 2004.
That's when I think I first met you 20 years ago.
That's probably right, Jonathan. Yeah. That's probably right. Because I started The Scientist in 2002, but I kind of got more. Richard came on in 2003, I think, and yeah. So, one thing I would tell myself 20 years ago is, yes, you should definitely ask that woman to marry you, because I proposed 20 years ago in April of 2004. I probably would have told myself, hurry up, because you're going to spend the rest of your life together. You might as well start now. But maybe on a professional level, I don't know. I think that I was probably a little bit impatient at the time, which I think served me well. But I would have probably said, you don't have to be quite as impatient. Spend some time really learning, professionally, taking the time to learn the skills that's possible for you to learn, gain the experience, dive a little bit deeper. It happens that 20 years ago was actually an important year for me. I mean, I did get married that year, but also I took on a much larger role at The Scientist magazine, which again is where Jonathan and I met, because the magazine was becoming bigger and changing in important ways. And I was delighted by that. I would also say, and this will maybe, I don't know how this will come out, but focus.
Go for it.
It goes along with being patient. Try things, but don't. Let's see. Try things, but also think about some focus and understand that saying no is actually a really important skill and a really important tactic in making sure you're successful. It's probably something that I've only learned somewhat recently, and maybe I certainly have much more luxury to say that now than I might have 20 years ago. But saying no is pretty critical. So even if you don't practice saying no earlier in your career, know that at some point you're going to want to do that. So maybe you should practice saying no earlier in your career.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Did that play ever get put on? Was it ever staged?
It was staged by my 6th grade class. It was probably more, I think it was more of a reading. I don't think we've
never been retracted.
No, it's still published.
It's still there.
I wish it weren't, but I did that. I'll send you the link just in case you're curious. It's, if you're really
awesome.
And I wouldn't say if you want to fall asleep, because you'll find it so horrifying that you won't be able to sleep. I would say if you ever, I don't know, are just feeling, like you need a laugh or a challenge, you can read it. But I'll send you the link. I have to find it and dig it up. Yeah.
So where can our readers hear more about your work?
So retractionwatch.com is sort of where my sort of other brain lives, if you will. You'll find a lot of other people's work there, but maybe my spiritual thinking, not spiritual, but my sort of, a bit of my oversight in my thinking. Thetransmitter.org, which is the publication that we launched here at the Simons Foundation in November, which was a relaunch of Spectrum, spectrumnews.org, which is about autism research. The Transmitter is all about all neuroscience research. Those are the two main places.
So that's it for this episode. Thank you for joining us at The Lonely Pipette.
We hope that you learned something new, that something resonated with your own experiences, or that you just enjoyed the science.
Let us know your thoughts on Twitter at Lonely Pipette, and please share it with your friends in the lab. If you want to join our community, you can subscribe to the Lonely Pipette mailing list or mail us by following the link available on our Twitter profile. You will receive the next episodes directly in your mailbox. How cool is that?
Stay tuned for the next show, and remember, you might feel like a lonely pipette, but it doesn't mean you're alone. Tips from the Lonely Pipette. can help you to do better science.
À bientôt!
À bientôt.